Good morning. It is Wednesday, May the 3rd. Welcome to Focus on the News. I'm Senator Dick Black, and we're joined by a good friend of ours, Jim Jatras. Jim, how are you doing this morning?
Great to see you, Senator. Good as usual. An honor and a pleasure as always.
Well, thank you. Our topic is going to be on Ukraine. And the gathering storm there. There's been a very, very dramatic event that has occurred with the attack on the Kremlin. Jim, what have you heard on that so far?
All I've heard is it was something that happened overnight, involved drones. I don't know how many drones and how close it may have come. Obviously, it would be assumed that the Ukrainians would be behind this. I don't know how realistic the chance of actually killing President Putin would be. I can't imagine that that's the sort of thing that would be received very well in Moscow. And I don't know. I think Senator, we're entering a very dangerous time here. I think this kind of thing shows the utter irresponsibility of the kind of people we're dealing with in Kiev, plus their backers in the Western countries.
Yeah, I worry very much about the people in the White House, the people in London who are planning and instigating this whole thing. I wonder, do you think perhaps there is a realization that things are not going Ukraine's way in the war, and perhaps there are some of the people in the White House and in London who are saying, maybe the only way that we can come out victorious on this is to somehow trigger a nuclear exchange.
I fear that's the case. I think there are signs of dissent or a discord within the Western establishment. For example, I think the leak of these documents by this kid Teixeira, that they're trying to make it him some kind of a lone wolf or something and charge him with espionage. I think it indicates there are people inside the establishment, primarily I would say in the intelligence community and maybe at the Pentagon, who realize exactly what you're saying here, that this thing is going south on them very, very quickly. And they're looking at a humiliating defeat that will make Afghanistan look like a cakewalk. But they're dealing with people at the State Department and the White House who are only interested in doubling down any way they can. And I think that's why we're entering a kind of a maximum zone of danger here. You point out regarding this assassination attempt as it appears on President Putin. Look, the Russians could have killed Zelensky anytime they wanted to during the course of this war, and they've chosen not to do so. I think all along, Russian restraint and in trying to make sure this thing doesn't escalate has been treated by their Western so-called partners as weakness and indecision that they then can exploit. And my concern is that when and if this much ballyhooed offensive takes place and the Russians deal with it in their usual kind of matter-of-fact style and maybe even pull back from the line a little bit to allow the Ukrainians some space to come in and get destroyed, that this will be used as some kind of a pretext to call for a ceasefire, which then would be just cynically used as another kind of delaying tactic to try to build up the Ukrainian forces and keep them in the field to fight for another day. Whether the Russians will fall for that or not, I don't know. I mean, they seem to be sometimes like Charlie Brown kicking the football when it comes to Western peace offers that the people behind them, like whether it's Merkel or the Obama administration or the current administration, have no intention of keeping. And will they fall for that? I don't know. So there's a lot on the table here, Senator. And you're right. There may be some people who simply figured the only way to save this thing is to expand the war, to escalate the war, and damn the consequences.
I remember back, of course, the Vietnam War was was the one that I fought in, and is very much a part of my life as a young fellow. And I recall quite vividly that when President Nixon, put in place the process of Vietnamization, the Vietnamese took control, and they began to surprise the world really with their success. And by then the Viet Cong had been essentially eliminated as a military force during the Tet Offensive of 1968. And the U.S. withdrew its troops in 1972, and almost immediately afterwards, North Vietnam launched a huge cross-border attack into South Vietnam. And so there was a great collision between the South Vietnamese army, the North Vietnamese army, without much intervention by the U.S. at all. And the South Vietnamese held their own. Many of us thought they had fairly decisively won the battle in the Easter Offensive. The next thing that happened is that North Vietnam sued for peace. They entered into a peace agreement, and but what you had so many of these liberal politicians, mostly Democrats, who really had staked their political existence on the destruction of South Vietnam, because they had said, oh, you know, South Vietnam is bad, and North Vietnamese is, Ho Chi Minh's going to usher in a people's paradise. And so when they ousted President Nixon over a very, very trivial affair that occurred, they almost immediately introduced legislation that literally cut off all of the fuel, the ammunition, the food, everything we had been providing to the South. And and they just deliberately collapsed the South Vietnamese resistance. And because of that, the North took over and ushered in a people's paradise, and put 1 million people in concentration camps. They executed estimated 3.5 million right off the bat, and then people were fleeing into the vast South China Sea for the next 10 years to avoid the people's paradise. So I kind of see something similar happening here, only in this case, we have the same type of people, only they are so committed to the destruction of Russia that they're willing to do anything, just as the people were back in Nixon's time. They were willing to basically cut the throats of people who had fought with us for many years. Now, I do worry about the recklessness of these people. You know, they were willing to destroy the Nord Stream pipeline, even though it risked America's position in the entire global makeup. And they now we've seen them previously cooperate in these drone strikes on Russian nuclear bases, where the Russian bombers are ready to be loaded up with nuclear weapons and sent into battle. And Ukraine has done a little poke in the eye to see how that would work out, and done drone attacks there. So it's very interesting. What do you think that what is happening? Over the winter, there were predictions that there would be a big Russian offensive that never entirely gelled. Now you have discussions about a big Ukrainian offensive. How do you evaluate those things, Jim?
Well, first off, I think your Vietnam comparison is excellent because it shows the interplay between the domestic and the international. As you pointed out, the people opposed to Nixon, and let's remember, whatever you may think of Nixon as a president, he won the biggest landslide, popular margin of victory in American history. And then he was removed by essentially was like a domestic coup from his political opposition, his own party, and also the deep state. Let's never forget that at the same time, like you were saying, they really wanted to make sure that South Vietnam went down the tube. Removing Nixon was also at the top of their agenda. We have to say the same thing here. Yes, the kind of people running the policy in our country today, they're focused on Ukraine. They're focused on provoking a war with the Chinese over Taiwan. But above all, they're focused on domestic political power. Indict Trump, get Tucker off the air, create a virtual democracy, a virtual political system, a virtual media where they can come after the kind of, lumpen Americans, the kind of legacy Americans that they're trying to destroy here. Anybody who's not, with Black Lives Matter or the alphabet soup of rainbow colors and climate change and the Great Reset and all that, we're the real enemy here. Even more than the Russians are. We're the real enemy. Mm-hmm. So I think we can never forget that this is really at the top of their agenda here. As far as what's going to happen next, again, I don't. Everybody says, anybody who has any kind of sense realizes the Ukrainians are not in a position to launch an offensive. And even if they had any kind of success in the offensive, they cannot replace the men and materiel they would expend during this offensive. Apparently, the weather over there is terrible at the moment, but they're really getting prodded from Washington and from London that they have to do it anyway. Now, some people look at that and say, well, that's just irrational. It makes no sense. Militarily, it makes no sense. Well, the Ukrainians have been fighting mostly a PR war up till now, but if they get their head handed to them, that's not much of a PR victory either. That's why I'm concerned that what really is being prepared here is some kind of a political jujitsu over a ceasefire call. I think they will try to launch some sort of offensive. I think they will present it as some kind of a great victory, even though it is not. In fact, I think it's very similar to what you were saying about the Tet Offensive and the Viet Cong. Remember how the media played that at the time, that somehow, the shows were losing the war, blah, 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 when in fact, the Viet Cong was devastated by that offensive. It was a strategic defeat for them on an unimaginable scale, but it was a great propaganda victory. So I think that's what we're probably looking at, something here when the Ukrainians do get around to launching this offensive. At that point, it would seem to me that the Russians, unlike the case in the winter when they hadn't fully retrained their reservists and the ground had not frozen, apparently it was a very mild winter, were not able to launch that attack. It seems to me that once that Ukrainian offensive fails, there would be nothing to stop the Russians from finally taking what they call a big arrow kind of offensive into Ukraine that would really knock Ukraine out of the war. That's why I think that somehow they're trying to cook up a strategy to keep the Russians from doing that, to float some kind of phony peace deal, even a phony deal that would be conducive to Russian interests, and hope the Russians fall for it again. I don't know whether they will do that or not.
Yeah, we have a question that's come in, a comment about the U.S. nuclear stockpile aging and obsolete. Can the Russian and Chinese systems disable the U.S. nuclear stockpile? In other words, is a nuclear war winnable by Russia and China? My immediate reaction to that is no. That I'm not sure the Chinese nuclear capability is not nearly that of the United States or Russia, and I don't think anyone has a real good handle on how how capable Russia's nuclear stockpile is. We know that it's capable of doing enormous damage, but I wouldn't undersell the United States when it comes to a nuclear war. But to some extent, don't you think the whole question of who could win, who could prevail in a nuclear war is somewhat academic, Jim?
Absolutely, Senator. I mean, I think it should scare the socks off everybody that people are even asking these questions. The idea that somebody might be tempted to just have a little nuclear war, a little bit of nukes, and hope that can be contained should worry everybody a lot. Because, yeah, I can understand that somebody who would say, from the Chinese perspective, for example, that they have a much smaller nuclear arsenal than the United States and Russia has. But on the other hand, look, if they want to remove an American carrier group for pedagogical purposes, yes, a small nuclear weapon would do the job on that quite fine. But then what would be the American response? What happens next after that? You know, you hear all this nonsense we've been hearing for the last year that the Russians are desperate. They're going to resort to nuclear weapons. Well, I don't think the Russians are desperate. I don't think they're going to resort to nuclear weapons. I do wonder what that kind of talk maybe signifies in terms of somebody trying to cook up a false flag or some kind of a dirty nuclear incident of some sort to try to blame it on the Russians and to use this as some kind of a political lever. I mean, again, I don't think we can underestimate the kind of dirty tricks and dishonesty of the kind of people we unfortunately have ruling us right now, that of the kind we've seen over the years with respect to, like, Syria, for example, and all these claims about chemical weapons use in Syria so they could keep that pot boiling along as well. You know, there just doesn't seem to be any kind of degree of responsibility and decency in the minds of most of the people making these policies. I hope there are professionals, at least at the Pentagon and in the intelligence services, who can exercise some kind of restraint, but I'm not overly confident in that respect.
Yeah. Our listeners are pointing out that the Russians have their S-500 and other weapons specifically designed to shoot down Trident multiple independently. The MIRVs, that individually targeted reentry vehicles, and that they have electronic weapons that can, destroy the electronics of even some of our nuclear subs. I always take these weapons with a grain of salt, because if you look at the exchanges you're seeing right now, the Russians on paper have weapons that should be able to penetrate the enemy's defenses all over the place. The Ukrainians have weapons that should be able to block all of the weapons. What you see is basically some get shot down, a lot of them go through, and I think that's what we would have in a nuclear exchange. Each side would have some defenses that they would employ. They would shoot down a lot of nuclear weapons, but in the end, one way or the other, New York City, Washington, D.C., Moscow, St. Petersburg would be cities of radioactive glass with no human life remaining. And that would be just the beginning, because London, Berlin, Paris, lots of places, San Francisco, Los Angeles, so many places would simply cease to be inhabitable by human or even basic animal life. So anyone who thinks in terms of winning a nuclear war, I think it's not a real productive mindset, because it is the consequences of it. If 10% of the nuclear weapons got through, well, you've got roughly 5,000 American nukes, 5,000 Russian. I mean, give or take 1,000. And so you get 10%. You're talking about 500 hydrogen weapons, for the most part, weapons that are, 100 times or 1,000 times what the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were. There's not going to be much left when it's all said and done.
No, and the idea that either side, if we get to that level of confrontation, is going to sit back and say, that's okay, we've got countermeasures, we have defenses. As you say, nobody imagines those defenses are perfect. That once you get to that level of confrontation, each side is in what they call a use them or lose them situation, that they're going to throw everything they have at the enemy and hope that it gets through and it does more damage on them than it does on us. But at that point, it's it's a pretty foolish comparison as to who's deader more. And so the idea that they're even flirting with this kind of thing is just terrifying.
Yes, and looking to the spring offensive, I think what happened is, at least to some extent, the Russians may have been very genuinely prepared to launch a winter offensive, but the ground never froze sufficiently, and it's probably not quite accurate to describe the ground in Ukraine as quicksand. It's not quicksand. But it's mud of enormous difficulty. When I was in Vietnam, I made a blunder one day, and we were walking along the side of a road, an unpaved road. I guess you'd call it a trail, but it was a very wide trail. And Vietnam had this problem with a very, very difficult kind of mud. And during the rainy season, it got to be really something. And I made the mistake of trying to just wade across the water and cross to the other side of the road. And before I knew it, I had gone 5 or 6 steps, and I sank in the mud down to my waist, and to the point where trying to move just would slowly inch me down and down in the mud. And they pulled up an Amtrak, which was an armored personnel carrier, and they threw me a thick rope. A rope was probably 2-inch diameter rope, and I put it around myself and put a loop, and then the guys inside the Amtrak pulled on it. Well, they yanked, and I had to yell at them because they were separating my spine. I could literally feel my spine starting to come, and I couldn't get out of this loop. And fortunately, they responded quickly. They let the pressure off, and then I yelled instruction to them. I said, "Look," I said, just give it slow, steady pressure, but don't jerk that thing. You're gonna snap my back in half." And they did that, and then they dragged me across the mud on my face. And I came out. I looked like a ghost out of Ghostbusters. I was all totally gray from head to toe. But I'm going to tell you, you get that kind of mud, and vehicles they find it totally impassable. So I think this is what happened to the to the Russian offensive. At least that was a major element. Now, the dry season is coming. Ukraine has been waiting for the dry season to arrive. I think they are going to launch a fairly serious attack. But in the meantime, the Russians have solidified defensive positions enormously. It's nothing like it used to be. Now their defenses are well manned. Their manpower has had all this extra time to do additional training, and I believe it was the great German armored General Guderian during the Second World War, who said that he was talking about the Soviets rather than Russians, but he said the Soviets are almost always stubborn in the defense. Now, you know, you don't often hear generals pay compliments of that sort to the enemy, but I think it said a lot that here was the great, probably the greatest German armor general, and he was sort of cautioning the world. You know, when you deal with the Soviets, and in this case, he was fighting in the battle for Moscow, and so he was fighting Russians for the most part, and so I think what we're likely to find is that when the Ukrainians launch their attack, I think they're going to find themselves running into a wall of steel, and it's going to be a very difficult situation for them. But I suppose that will unfold soon.
Yes, and of course they've had plenty of time to prepare these defenses. I mean, I think the proof in the pudding here is says we're essentially talking about the same people, Russians and Ukrainians. Is like, look how stubborn the Ukrainian defenses have been. Look how long it's taken for the Russians to grind down Bakhmut. Now they're doing that in a very deliberative way, where they're not going to try to sacrifice large numbers of their soldiers and allow the Ukrainians to keep sending more men and material in to be, destroyed by the Russians. But the Ukrainians have been doing that very stubbornly as well. The Russians will do the same. That's one reason why once Bakhmut breaks and once this offensive fails, as I believe it will fail, assuming they launch it at all, the Ukrainians won't be in much of a position to resist after that, if the Russians play their cards right. And then the real question is what they do after that. I don't know. The next couple months I think are going to be decisive. I tend to agree with people like Scott Ritter and a few others that this war, if it is simply prosecuted in military terms and we don't get distracted into some kind of a phony peace process, that it should be over by the early fall. And I hope that's the case. And by the way, Senator, if I sound dismissive about the idea of a peace process or a ceasefire, that, don't you want the dying to stop and so forth? Yes, of course I do. But on the other hand, I'd rather see a decisive end of it militarily that actually ends this war and closes the prospect of a bigger, even more devastating war, than one that causes the thing to keep going on and going on and going on, and then also increase the risk of escalation in a way that could involve far more people dying that are dying now. I want them to get it over with, finish this thing off, win a decisive victory in this war, present NATO with a fait accompli, and let's hope then that when the chips fall where they may, something can rise from the ashes. Because otherwise, I think we're looking at something far, far worse than we can even imagine based on current circumstances.
Yeah, to me, one of the paradoxical situations is that if the United States is victorious, if we carry out Barack Obama's plan when he overthrew the government in 2014, and we managed to extend the reach of NATO right to the Russian border. The United States will have lost an enormous amount, because now there will be no time to have human deliberation if nuclear weapons are fired from Ukraine, or perhaps even if they were to be fired the other way. At the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had 1,000 miles between the border of Germany and the border of Russia. So that was 1,000 miles separating the two great nuclear powers of the world. And this was a healthy thing. It was a good thing. It gave time for deliberation if something untoward happened on one side or the other. We had established a hotline back during the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so we could communicate one way or the other, and we could clarify things that seemed very suspicious on the radar and satellites. Now we have closed that gap, and Ukraine is the final part of the gap. And once we manage, if we should somehow manage to restore the border of Ukraine to what it was originally, there is no way in which Russia can defend itself against a thermonuclear attack except by programming its nuclear deterrence to react according to certain prescribed methods. So there will not be an opportunity for human intervention. There's not time to wake up President Putin to say, President Putin, what do you think we should do? Because it takes too long for him to wake up, and by then the missiles have struck Moscow and St. Petersburg. So it's got to be an automatic, computer-driven response, artificial intelligence at work, if you will, without human intervention. And it almost, over time, if we achieve that, over time, it almost guarantees the destruction of mankind, because maybe nothing happens in the first year, the second year, maybe not in 10 years, but over time, a small probability expands to a very large probability. And so the irony is we have embarked on this enterprise to disintegrate Russia, to break it into its component parts, and were we to succeed, it would be one of the great failings, perhaps the decisive failing that brings about the end of mankind.
Well, that's right, and I'm glad you mentioned the part about breaking Russia up, bringing down the Russian government. Let's not forget that regime change by making Moscow's position militarily and also economically and financially untenable has always been the Holy Grail in this, to have regime change in Moscow. And of course, there are a lot of pluses associated with that. We'll have pride parades in Moscow and Petersburg, and drag shows at all the schools, and Bud Light for everybody. I mean, it's this idea that we can impose what kind of degeneracy has now become the state religion of the Western countries on all of Russia and Eastern Europe is I think a huge part of what we're seeing here. I like to call this World War trans. It's some kind of a values driven war, much more so than most people suspect. because the kind of people, again, back to the kind of domestic confrontation we see from these people, for them, it really is a kind of religious war. It's a religious war domestically. It's a religious war internationally. And I don't think there's any escaping from that. And I think most Americans don't really appreciate how central that is to what has led to us to where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It's almost like a fantasy to imagine that something as meaningless as all this weird homosexual behavior, the child grooming, the pedophilia, could literally drive America to its destruction. But just this morning, I saw that the Navy is now launching a new recruiting campaign. They're falling way short of their recruiting goals. I think about 6,000 men short. And so what are they doing? Are they putting something to show that real men join the Navy? No, they've got a big ad campaign by a transvestite who is actually a Navy enlisted man, and he suits up as a woman. He does all sort of these bizarre sexually provocative things aboard ship, and they literally show him on ship with other sailors, and he's launching his perverse performances. I will tell you that when I was the chief of the criminal law division for the Army in the Pentagon, Bill Clinton was attempting to launch gays in the military. We blocked him. I largely blocked him, and with help from thousands of people. But I could see what could happen, because at that time we were very careful to screen out homosexuals from the military, and yet the Office of the Judge Advocate General submitted a report to Congress at their request, and we identified 102 criminal cases in which homosexuals had attacked their bunkmates, their subordinates, children, Boy Scouts. There were four different incidents where Boy Scouts were attacked by homosexual soldiers or sailors or whatever. And so now, of course, there's no barrier. And what that tells you is that there is now this ongoing process of disintegration of law and order within the military. You'll hear very little of it because there just are not people like me on active duty anymore who will disclose what's going on and reveal the extent of it. But I'm going to tell you, if we were having 102 criminal cases within a year's period, I think, if that was happening when we carefully screened out and immediately eliminated anyone identified with homosexuality, if that was happening back then, you can imagine that how many multiples of that misbehavior is going on in the ranks today. I know a young Marine sergeant who was put out of the military for not getting the COVID shot. And when she went through Marine boot camp, she had lesbian drill instructors, and at night they just have a big orgy, a big lesbian orgy that would go on in the barracks. And there was just sort of a contempt for Christianity, because of course, the whole idea of homosexual sodomy is on a collision course with with Christianity, with Islam, with all of the world's major religions. So it is a religion unto itself, and it's not taking us in a good direction. Well, Jim, do you have a final remark before we sign off?
Not really, Senator. I think we've covered the waterfront here. It's just that I have this feeling on my stomach that we're nearing some sort of crescendo, that all the data points are starting to converge in something fairly big. And I don't know whether that would be something overseas, whether it be in Ukraine, whether it be in the South China Sea, whether it would be domestically here in the United States, some kind of a crackdown related to the establishment's, war on dissent within here in the United States. Something seems to be in the cards. I don't know what it is, but what is it? Something wicked this way comes from Macbeth. So hold on to your hats, folks. I think we're in for a rough ride.
Thank you, Jim. This has been Focus on the News. Thank you for joining us.